Have you ever noticed that there is a moment in the life of Jesus that is so mysterious, so unsettling, that even after 2,000 years, no one has been able to fully explain what really happened? It's not one of the miracles everyone talks about. It's not the crucifixion. It's not even the resurrection. It's a quiet moment, almost invisible, but loaded with tension, silence, and something deeply uncomfortable. Because on that day, Jesus didn't start by speaking. He did something no one expected. He bent down and began to write on the ground. And here's what makes this moment so disturbing. No one knows what he wrote. Not his disciples. Not the people who were there. Not even the ones who later recorded the event. The text simply says that he wrote, and then it moves on. As if the most important detail was intentionally left out. And that silence has created one of the greatest mysteries in all of Scripture, because whatever Jesus wrote that day was powerful enough to stop a public execution. It all began in Jerusalem, early in the morning. The city was already alive. People moving through the streets, merchants opening their stalls, teachers gathering their followers. And in the middle of all that movement, Jesus was teaching again. This wasn't unusual. Wherever he went, crowds formed. Some came because they believed. Others came because they were curious. And many came for a different reason. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. Because by that point, the religious leaders were no longer just observing him. They saw him as a threat. His words challenged their authority. His actions broke their expectations. And his influence was growing fast. It was only a matter of time before they tried to trap him in a way he couldn't escape. And on that day, they thought they had found the perfect opportunity. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The teaching stopped. A group of men forced their way through the crowd. They were not alone. They were dragging a woman with them. She wasn't walking freely. She was being pulled, pushed, humiliated in front of everyone. Her face showed fear, shame, desperation. She couldn't even look up. And without needing a long explanation, everyone understood what was happening. She had been accused of adultery. Caught in the act, they said. No debate, no defense, no escape. According to the law, the punishment was clear. She deserved to die. Stoning, it was a sentence that left no room for mercy. And everyone there knew it. But what they said next revealed their true intention. They were not there for justice. They were not there for truth. They were there for Jesus. They wanted him to answer. Because no matter what he said, he would lose. If he agreed with the law and told them to stone her, he would destroy his message of mercy. But if he told them to let her go, he would be accused of rejecting the law. It was a perfect trap, at least. That's what they believed. The crowd went silent. Every eye turned toward him. The accusers stood confident, holding their stones, waiting. The woman trembled, expecting the worst. And Jesus said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at them immediately. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He bent down and started writing on the ground. Can you imagine that moment? The tension in the air, the confusion on their faces, the silence growing heavier by the second. And Jesus, in the middle of it all, tracing something into the dust. This is the only moment in all the Gospels where Jesus is described as writing something. And yet, no one tells us what it was. Why? How could something so important be left out? Some believe that this detail was never meant to be recorded, that those words were not for us, but for the people standing there. Because whatever he was writing began to affect them. Something changed. The men who arrived full of certainty started to hesitate. Something about that act, that silence, that movement of his hand, began to disturb them. But Jesus didn't stop. He kept writing, slowly, calmly, as if he wasn't in a hurry, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. And then, finally, he stood up. He looked at them, and he said a sentence that would echo through history. Let the one who is without sin throw the first stone. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was simple, direct, unavoidable. And then, he bent down again and continued writing, as if the answer was already complete, as if there was nothing more to explain. And that's when everything began to change. Because one by one, they started to leave. Not all at once. Not in a group. One by one, starting with the oldest. Why the oldest first? What did they see? What did they understand? What was written there? Because remember, Jesus was writing something, and whatever it was, it had enough power to make men who came ready to kill drop their stones. Do you understand what that means? Something invisible changed their decision. Something silent was stronger than their certainty. And this is where the story becomes even more intense. Because the text doesn't say they changed their minds. It doesn't say they were convinced by an argument. It says they left, convicted by their own conscience, as if something inside them had been exposed, as if something they had hidden was suddenly brought into the light. And that leads to the question that has disturbed people for centuries. What did Jesus write on the ground that day? Some believe he wrote the sins of each accuser. Names, actions, hidden things no one else knew. Others think he wrote passages of the law, reminding them that no one was truly without guilt. And there is an even more unsettling idea, that he wasn't writing for everyone to read, but for each person to understand. That what was written spoke directly to the heart of each individual. Because sometimes, truth doesn't need a long explanation. Sometimes, one word is enough. And in that moment, silence became louder than any accusation, because no one could stand against what they were seeing or feeling. And one by one, they left, until no one remained holding a stone, until the noise was gone, until only two people were left in the center of that scene, Jesus and the woman. And everything that was about to happen next would change the meaning of that moment forever. But there is something in this story that most people never notice. Something that is not directly written, but can be felt between every line, like a quiet presence shaping everything that happens. Because when you look closely at that moment, you realize it was never just about a woman, never just about a law, and never just about a trap. It was about something much deeper, the collision between truth and the human heart. And at the center of that collision was what Jesus wrote on the ground. For centuries, people have tried to understand it. Scholars, historians, theologians, all asking the same question. What could have been so powerful, so personal, that it caused an entire group of men, ready to execute someone, to simply walk away in silence? One of the oldest interpretations connects this moment to a passage from the prophet Jeremiah, where it says that those who turn away from God will have their names written in the dust of the earth. Not carved in stone, not preserved forever, written in dust, something temporary, something that can disappear. And if that is true, then Jesus writing on the ground wasn't random. It was intentional. It was symbolic, as if he was showing that the accusations of those men had no eternal weight, that their judgment was fragile, temporary, incomplete, that what they were trying to enforce was missing something essential. But there is another interpretation, one that has been repeated in many discussions, and it is far more unsettling. Some believe that Jesus was writing the hidden sins of each of the accusers, not in a general sense, but specifically, personally, secrets, moments, things they had buried so deeply that no one else could ever know. Imagine standing there, holding a stone, convinced of your own righteousness, and then seeing something written in the dust that only you recognize, something that exposes you, something that reminds you that you are not as clean as you pretend to be. What would you do in that moment? Would you still throw the stone? Or would you quietly step back and leave? The text gives us a clue. It says they left one by one, beginning with the oldest. That detail matters, because the older someone is, the more they have lived, the more they remember, the more they carry, more experiences, more mistakes, more things they would rather forget. And perhaps, as they saw what was written, they realized something they could not deny, that they were standing in judgment, while carrying their own guilt. And suddenly, the weight of the stone in their hand became heavier than they expected, so they dropped it. But there is a third interpretation, and it may be the most powerful of all. Some suggest that Jesus wasn't writing something meant to be read with the eyes, but understood within the conscience, that what he wrote wasn't necessarily visible in the same way to everyone, that each person saw something different, something that spoke directly to their own heart. Because the conscience does not need long arguments. It doesn't need explanations. When truth touches it, it reacts immediately. And in that moment, there was no need for a debate, no need for a confrontation. The truth was already doing its work, silently, deeply, personally. And that's why no one resisted. That's why no one argued back. Because you can argue against words, but it's much harder to argue against what you know is true inside you. Now think about this carefully. The religious leaders knew the law perfectly. They had studied it their entire lives. They knew how to apply it, how to interpret it, how to defend it. But in that moment, all of that knowledge was not enough. Because they were not facing a legal argument. They were facing truth itself. And truth does something that rules and systems cannot do. It exposes the heart. That's why they left. not because they were defeated in a debate, but because they were confronted with something they could not escape. And this is where the story stops being just a historical event and becomes something personal, because the same question still exists today. What would happen if what Jesus wrote that day was revealed now, not about others, but about you? What would appear in the dust? Your thoughts, your actions, the things you hide from everyone else. Because it's easy to judge when we are not the ones being exposed. It's easy to point, to accuse, to feel justified, as long as the light is not on us. But the moment truth comes close, everything changes. And that's exactly what happened that day. No one was forced to leave. No one was publicly shamed. No one was chased away. They simply couldn't stay, because the truth made it impossible. And eventually, only one person remained who had the right to judge. Only one person there was truly without sin. Only one had the authority to throw the stone, and he chose not to. Think about that. The only one who had the right to condemn decided not to. But he also did not ignore the truth. When Jesus stood up and looked at the woman, he asked her, "Where are your accusers?" She said, "There is no one, Lord." And then he said something that has been repeated for centuries, but rarely understood in its full depth. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." This is not permission. This is transformation. He did not say, "What you did doesn't matter." He did not deny her sin. He did not redefine right and wrong. Instead, he gave her something much harder. A second chance, with responsibility, freedom, with a call to change. And this is what makes this moment so powerful, because grace is not the absence of truth. It is the presence of mercy in the middle of truth. And that changes everything. Now, there is one more detail that most people miss. Jesus bent down twice. Not once, twice. He wrote, he spoke, and then he wrote again. Why repeat the same action? Some believe the first time was to confront the accusers, and the second was to confirm what was already happening inside them. As if to say, the truth has been revealed. Now the decision is yours. And each one made a decision, to stay or to leave, to hold on to the stone or to let it fall. And every single one of them chose to leave, leaving behind not just the stones, but the illusion of their own righteousness. And in the end, the scene that began with accusation ended in silence, mercy, and a new beginning, all because of something that was written in the dust and never recorded. And maybe that is the point. Maybe those words were never meant to be preserved, because their purpose was not to inform, but to transform. Because what matters is not what was written that day, but what it revealed. And that leads to one final question, the one you cannot avoid. If you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away? Because that choice still exists today. Every time you judge, every time you point at someone else, every time you hold a stone in your hand, and maybe, just maybe, the words Jesus wrote on that ground were never lost. Maybe they continue to be written every time truth reaches a human heart. And if this story made you think, if it challenged you, if it made you see something differently, then there is something you can do right now. Share this message, because there are still many people holding stones, without realizing what is really at stake. And perhaps, this story is exactly what they need to hear.